Dear Agony Aunt, I have been happily married for 33 years and have 2 wonderful adult children. I love my husband deeply and we share a strong, committed relationship. However, I also love another man. This relationship has in many ways made me more loving and present in my marriage, helping me stay in it. And yet I struggle with guilt. I hate the secrecy and the deception. I don't want to hurt anyone, but I also don't know how to reconcile these conflicting feelings. How do I navigate this without losing myself or those I love?
Yeah, it's such a tough question. And I can hear what a difficult position that you feel that you're in, where your love for this other man, it doesn't in any way diminish your love for your husband. And yet, I'm assuming, although you haven't said, that the contract with your husband is essentially a monogamous one. And whether it's an emotional affair or a physical affair, I'm not sure. One of the first things I thought when Emily was reading the question was how actually Mum has always said, you can love more than one person. And I think there is a sort of common narrative out there that that's not necessarily possible. You just can only love one person. So I suppose that's the first thought and reflection I had, that this is a real thing and that you can love people in different ways. And it may be that your husband and this other man meet you in different ways.
Meet different needs,
which is, I guess I took that reference from saying it helps you stay in your marriage. I feel like my first response is that I don't really know the right answer to your question. I think it's common that people have partners and affairs outside their marriage in order to sustain their marriages. I think that's a very common occurrence. And it sounds like the difficulty is that it threatens the trust, really, because they are hiding it.
They're hiding it. And I think that it's possible, maybe even likely, that at some point your husband will find out. It's hard to hide things indefinitely, even if he finds out not in any kind of short period of time. The person that I thought of is Dan Savage, who has a sex and relationship podcast. And he sort of talks of lots of different variations of marriage. And one of the things that he talks about, which is definitely controversial and lots of people would not agree with, is that some people have a kind of version of marriage where they have affairs, or they have, like, maybe their marriage is a sexless marriage. And so they seek sex or physical intimacy elsewhere without telling their partner, and they're sort of doing what they're doing to what he calls stay married and stay sane. And the sort of reasons for doing it is exactly as you described, which is that there is still love in the marriage that they're in, and also a lot of practical reasons to stay married, often to do with like parenting and finances and all the other things that go along with marriage. And that for some people, that feels like an option. And like Soph said, I don't think that there's a sort of right or wrong, obvious answer of what you should do. There are just, I think, probably various options and ways of thinking about it that we can give to you to think about. I mean, I think the other person that talks and writes a lot about infidelity in marriage is obviously Esther Perel. And I think she is an interesting person to listen to because she does it. I suppose a lot of the way she talks about infidelity is that it's not as binary as like there's a good guy and a bad guy. It's that infidelity is a sort of portal into the relationship, into the lay of the land. And it doesn't mean that it's not a betrayal of trust, right? If you have a monogamous contract, it is a betrayal to go outside of that. But there are all sorts of betrayals in a marriage, and a relationship. I mean, like Soph said, you don't describe what kind of relationship you have with this other man. That's what, like, infidelity is a one form of betrayal, but there are many others as well that can be really deeply impactful, that don't carry the same sort of social villainy that having an affair carries. And I think when you sort of think of it through that lens, it's just a sort of more compassionate way of thinking about behavior. It doesn't mean that it's good to betray somebody's trust, but it does sort of say, like, okay, but there's probably a reason for this. And it doesn't have to mean that your husband is horrible or your partner is horrible. It just means that there's something that you're getting from somebody else, and there's probably a reason for that.
Yes, and that often one of the things that Esther Perel says, which I think is really interesting, is she says how often the affair has nothing to do with the partner or the husband at all. Doesn't mean it, and it obviously needs to be navigated within a marriage or partnership, because there's been hurt, there's been betrayal, there's been lying. But it isn't always the case. I think sometimes the assumption is, especially as the partner that is been hurt, that they must not have been doing something for their partner in some way for them to want to have an affair. But often it can be things like parts of themselves that they never let themselves explore or don't let themselves bring into that marriage, and they only really allow themselves to do that in secrecy. But that's not the partner putting a stop to that. That's an internal split. She also talks a lot about aliveness as one of the other main drivers of why people go out. Her book, Mating in Captivity, is like there is this big conflict between our need for safety and security and love, which comes with continuity and familiarity and home, whatever that means to you, and our need for desire, which is based around novelty and excitement. And that's very hard to sustain in a monogamous long-term relationship. I guess I was thinking, if you were my client, I would hope that what we could do is really sit in the dilemma and honestly weigh the possible outcomes of the different decisions. Because sometimes can be possible to minimize the consequences if we don't want to look something in the eye. So, for example, if your partner does find out at a later date, is this really the decision you want to make, not to tell him and take that risk? I'm not saying you should or you shouldn't, but sitting in the proper dilemma of what this means to you, what this means to your family, what this means to your love and your love of both partners, and seeing what emerges from that, sort of being in your reality and really having a sense of how it feels and what it all means to you, such that you can make choices that feel like the best choices that you can make in a really difficult situation.
It's probably quite radical for most people, but there are people out there who are non-monogamous, not because they sort of originally intended to be non-monogamous, but because it just sort of happened. And that maybe feels like, ooh, that would not be us. It wouldn't work for us. But I think while you're sort of sitting in the dilemma, it's worth considering all options, being open.
Yes, and obviously, polyamory or having multiple partners with the mutual agreement and consent ethically within a partnership is very different to having an affair.
No, exactly. But I suppose that's what I'm sort of saying. Like, maybe there's a
option
universe. Maybe, I suppose I'm just sort of throwing all the possibilities out there. I think we can both really hear the dilemma.
One of the things I think both me and Emily are trying to say is the advantage of bringing a compassionate, thoughtful, reflective lens to this dilemma, rather than a shaming, guilting, doing bad, which is often what culture delivers in these scenarios, is because really basically what happens is when we bring that kind of judgment to ourselves, we shut down and we don't want to think about it and we don't want to go there, and we just keep doing what we're doing because it feels too painful and too icky and sticky to feel, because we feel shame and we don't want to feel shame. So the advantage of bringing this more thoughtful, reflective and compassionate way of thinking about what's happening for you is because it will actually allow you to open to what is really happening, and then make a decision that feels like the best decision that you know how to make given where you are.
Yeah. I would really recommend listening to Dan Savage on this, because I think he's got an interesting lens. And then Esther Perel, she's got, I think, State of Affairs and Mating in Captivity that are both.
And TED Talks from her. The second one she said is specifically about affairs.
Yeah. And good luck. Good luck.